So some other important vocab to cover. Nation, human community conscious of sharing common culture, history, and sometimes religion. So nation does not equal state. So an example of nation is Palestine. Palestine is a nation of over 10 million people scattered across the globe, right? That's a nation. And then state, a political entity and a set of institutions that have authority over the population of a given territory. So an example of a state is Israel, the state of Israel. So what you'll notice during this presentation is when we say Israel, we mean the regime, the army, the military, we mean the institutions. When we say Palestine, we mean the land. So yeah. And nationalism is the belief that the people who form a nation should have their own political institution, ideally their own state, and that the interests of that nation should be promoted and protected at all costs. So Israel is a state ruling over the territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, and Palestine is the name of the historic territory between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, still referred to this way by many across the world. And Palestine is not a state or entity.
So the geography that we'll go through is Palestine, Israel, what now is the Palestinian territories, Gaza, and the West Bank. So what you'll see over here is the 1947 Jewish settlements that were put in after the British Mandate in 1948.
So here you see like the shrinking of Palestine, right? So this is 1948. Palestine is orange, yellow, I can't tell. And then you see Palestine shrinking as it goes on. And this map was from 2008, and Palestine has shrunk even more in the last 8 years. So right now you see like little like clumps of land making up the West Bank, and you see the Gaza Strip here.
So this is the Israeli-controlled areas in Gaza, and this is the Rafah crossing border between what now is Gaza and then Egypt, which is closed. So what's important to note is that Israel controls Gaza from the air and water. They don't control it from land. So it's impossible for them to get medical supplies and food and everything else through air or water.
Or borders.
Or borders. And nobody can leave and nobody can enter Gaza.
So this is just another picture. You see the Palestinian territories, which is Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and then here is Israel, what's known as Israel proper. And you see how the Palestinian territories are geographically disconnected, which is done on purpose. So this is just a clearer picture of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. Next. So the way we're going to present is kind of different than most presentations, probably about giving an introduction to Palestine, because we're not going to focus so much on the timeline or the chronology, because chronology has its shortcomings, right? Who decides which dates are important when the occupation is ongoing, right? So who's to say that today is not an important part of history? Yeah, so next. So pre-1948, British colonized Palestine from 1920 to 1948, and before the British was the Ottoman Empire. So during British colonialism, you see a lot of Jewish immigration from Europe as a result of rising anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. But during this time, there's a general sense of coexistence, right? Christians, Muslims, and Jews are living in this land at peace. And then in 1917, the Balfour Declaration is created, which encourages the Jewish population to establish a state inside of Palestine. And the Balfour Declaration was written by William Balfour, who's a British ruler. And basically, Balfour Declaration can be described as Party C giving Party A's land to Party B. That's the analogy that's often used to describe what it is. And then during this time, there is an anti-colonial Palestinian nationalist movement against the British Mandate from 1936 to 1939. And actually, they employed boycott against British goods during this time in Palestine. So there's a history of boycott in the Palestinian movement. So when people say BDS is anti-Semitic, it's been used as a tactic by Palestinians from before the Israelis were occupying Palestine. It was used against the British too. So, next.
So in 1948 was when the State of Israel was established in 78% of historical Palestine. And so the remaining 22% of Palestine was taken over by Jordan and Egypt. And so Jordan took over what is the West Bank, and then Egypt took over what is the Gaza Strip. And so in 1948, remember previously we had said that 750,000 Palestinians were expelled from their homes. And that is known as the Nakba, or the catastrophe.
So 1967 is the setback, or Nakba, which we talked about earlier. And it was a war between Israel and Arab states that lasted 6 days. In this time, Israel took over Gaza, the West Bank, Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, and Syria's Golan Heights. So key here is that Israel is an expansionist state, right? You see it expanding and encroaching into neighboring Arab states and denying their neighbors sovereignty and autonomy. Next.
So the 1980s are when the uprisings first started in Palestine. And so 1987 was the first Palestinian uprising against the Israeli occupation. And that uprising was completely nonviolent, and it consisted of unarmed mass protests in the West Bank and in the Gaza Strip.
So the First Intifada ended with the signing of the Oslo Accords, which is a treaty between the Palestine Liberation Organization and then the Israeli government. And it was signed in 1994. And it brought an end to the First Intifada. And this is when the State of Israel formally recognized the PLO as the governing body of the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And then in return, the PLO recognizes Israel's right to exist. So the Oslo Accords were supposed to bring about a two-state solution, or a solution to the conflict, and that it failed. So as a result, you see, next slide, the Second Intifada.
So the Second Intifada started in September of 2000, and it was different than the First Intifada because this one was violent.
Or armed.
Yeah, and it lasted up until 2005.
So yeah, and then some important facts about the Second Intifada. At least 4,973 Palestinian civilians were killed over the course of the Second Intifada. Among them were 1,262 children, 274 women, and 32 medical personnel attempting to administer aid to injured civilians. More than 10,000 children were wounded during the 5 years of violence. And most of the deaths and injuries came as a result of airstrikes against densely populated areas in the Gaza Strip and major land assaults on various West Bank cities, villages, and refugee camps. And then during the Second Intifada, Israel began its construction of the wall, which is actually illegal according to international law, right? 2 years after Israel began the construction of the wall, the International Court of Justice ruled it as illegal and ordered the construction to be halted, and Israel did not comply or abide. And you see this as a trend throughout this presentation. So during the Second Intifada, the Israeli occupation forces demolished some 5,000 Palestinian homes and damaged another 6,500 beyond repair. Next. So 2005, 2009, 2014, major events in Gaza. So Israel began its occupation of the Gaza Strip in 1967. We talked about that earlier. And then formally withdrew in 2005. So it's really important here to note that, like, when we say that Israel withdrew from Gaza Strip, that means they withdrew their settlers and their soldiers. But they did not actually withdraw, right? Israel still controls Gaza's borders, air, and water. And then you see here that even though they withdrew, they continue their military assaults every couple of years. So in 2009, Operation Kaslat, 1,400 Palestinians are killed during this time. This assault lasted a month, and over 400 children were killed during it. 2014, you see Operation Pillar of Defense, and over 2,100 Palestinians are killed, again, in the span of a month. So inside of Gaza, there's Palestinian rule, technically. right, Palestinians elected a government to rule over Gaza, which is Hamas. And Gaza is still under siege till this day, and arguably the siege is more destructive than the occupation. There's a lot of analysis that says this. And Gaza won't be livable by 2020 due to contamination of water and how densely populated it is. You have over 1.5 million Palestinians living in like 320 kilometers. Next. So some tools of oppression, and you can just read this to yourself. I'll go through a little bit, but prison, exile, military occupation, statelessness, the wall, checkpoints, border siege, weapons, assassinations, massacres, control of resources, destruction of resources, home demolitions, school closures, restriction of movement, and silencing abroad. So arbitrary arrest and illegal imprisonment of the members of a racial group. Who wants to read this quote? Yeah, go ahead.
Administrative detention is implemented solely on the basis of an administrative order, without either indictment or trial. Under certain circumstances, this type of detention may be lawful. However, due to the substantial injury to due process inherent in this measure, international law stipulates that it may be exercised only in very exceptional cases, and then only as a last possible resort when there are no other means available to prevent the danger. Nevertheless, Israeli authorities routinely employ administrative detention. Over the years, thousands of Palestinians have been held in Israeli custody as administrative detainees for extended periods of time.
So with this, Israel employs something called night raids. So in the middle of the night, they barge into Palestinian homes in villages known for popular struggle or uprising, and they target men, and who they consider men is boys 12 to 18. So Palestinian boys are denied their right to childhood. They're treated as men and they're tried as men in the Israeli military courts. So you see a rise in arbitrary arrest and detention in times that Israel considers a crisis. Next. So this is a graph that shows the rise and fall of arbitrary detention in Palestine. And does anyone notice a trend, like where it was the highest during what times?
During the first Intifada.
Yeah, during the second Intifada.
Second.
But yeah, right. 2001, you see it skyrocket. So when Israel feels discomfort, you see a rise of arrest of Palestinians.
And then another one is that they are denied the right to work. Who would like to read this one?
Military checkpoints, settler-only roads, closed military zones, and settlement areas. Furthermore, since the 1990s, Palestinian entry to Israel to settlement areas in the occupied Palestinian territory to East Jerusalem from other parts of the occupied Palestinian territory, and Palestinian movement between the West Bank and the Gaza Strip are subject to a pervasive permit system. Permits virtually impossible to obtain that severely curtails Palestinian freedom of movement and the right to access their workplace. Together with the annexation wall, these restrictions serve to divide the Palestinian population into enclaves while depriving Palestinians of access to approximately 40% of the West Bank, much of which they traditionally use for agriculture. Approximately 30,000 Palestinians cross the annexation wall without permits in search of employment in the Israeli labor market, where they are subject to exploitation.
What's important to note here is that we're not talking about Israel directly focusing on not allowing Palestinians the right to work. We're talking about the systems that hinder them to have the ability to go out and seek work. So things like the apartheid wall. About like 30,000 Palestinians try to cross checkpoints at the apartheid wall with and without permits to try and find jobs in the Israeli labor market. So, and even there, like, they're subject to exploitation. So,
Next. So, next. So, denied right to education. So this is a quote by Edward Said. The universities and the schools in Palestine are closed and opened by willful and punitive decree of the Israeli military authorities. When you consider that well over 2/3 of the population in occupied Palestine is made up of people under the age of 18, the sheer massive brutality of denying them school and college or university by systematic edict is extraordinary. At the same time, Jewish children and young people freely attend classes in their schools and universities, which are of a decent standard. There is now a generation of Palestinian children virtually being made illiterate, again by Israeli design and programmatic vision. Okay, so denied right to leave. So this focuses mainly on Palestinians living in the Gaza Strip. There's a siege on Gaza, and that means the border is closed, right? So they can't leave and they can't come in. Next. So yeah.
So denied right to return to their country. So this applies to Palestinians living in diaspora. So there's a UN resolution 194, that says Palestinian refugees have the right of return, but that has not been upheld in any way, shape, or form. And so on a day-to-day basis, so many Palestinians fear that they can't come back into their country, come back into their homeland. And for me, my dad is 62 and my mom is 57. And 2 years ago was the first time that they have ever been back in their homeland. And that is because that they were not allowed to. They were born in refugee camps in Lebanon. So in masses, Palestinians are banned from returning to their homeland, and it doesn't even become a political issue anymore. It's an issue of you returning to your roots and your culture and being able to understand that and really live it. Palestinians who are denied rights to their own homeland like that has so much effect on someone, and that is essentially why we have such a big problem with the system that denies them that.
Yeah, and this is done on purpose to maintain a Jewish majority in Palestine. So just keep that in mind. Denied right to a nationality. So this quote, I am a second-rate citizen, nationless in the Jewish state of Israel. And this is a Palestinian citizen of Israel, so a Palestinian who holds Israeli citizenship. So there are about 1 million Palestinians who hold Israeli citizenship, and we'll talk about the different groups of Palestinians later on in this presentation. Next. So denied right freedom of movements. So this is a picture of a checkpoint, and this is a picture of Jewish-only roads, and these are both existent in the West Bank. So there are over 500 Israeli checkpoints scattered throughout the West Bank that are inherently discriminatory, because Palestinians are the only people subjected to the discriminatory practices of these checkpoints, right? So a lot of these checkpoints have biometric identification systems, which are provided by Hewlett-Packard, which we targeted in our divestment resolution last year. These biometric identification systems, they are meant to differentiate between Israelis and Palestinians. And then oftentimes, pregnant Palestinian women are forced to give birth at these checkpoints because they're deemed a security threat by the Israeli guards there. So it's entirely arbitrary. And then Jewish-only roads, self-explanatory. This is in the West Bank. And then here you see arrows for the different roads. Next.
So denied right to residence. So people's homes are demolished every single day. Israel unlawfully destroys Palestinian infrastructure day in and day out. And that is their systemic denial of Palestinians to a home. So even if you are located in Palestine, you don't have a home anymore because we just demolished it. The UN's Fourth Geneva Convention under Article 53 states that an occupying power cannot lawfully destroy its subjects' infrastructure, which they don't adhere to because they don't adhere to anything. Yes.
So freedom of opinion. this is kind of like a complicated, it's not complicated, but it's a different one, right? Because you look at all of these other infringements on Palestinians' right to live, and this kind of seems like kind of a bougie thing to focus on, right? But it's important not to play like oppression Olympics. Like, the struggles of Palestinian citizens of Israel are just as important as the struggles of Palestinians elsewhere, because this is a result of like Israeli colonialism. At the end of the day, like, this is a symptom, another symptom of Israeli colonialism that's important to focus on. So this one is the Nakba bill, and it bans state funding for groups that commemorate the tragedy that befell Palestinians in 1948, where 750,000 Palestinians were forcefully expelled. Next. So, and then this is freedom of expression. So here is Hassan Kanafani. He's a Palestinian writer, and you might have seen this book in your Arabic Lit class if you took Arabic Lit here at Loyola. But he was assassinated by Israeli intelligence in 1972 in Beirut. So Beirut is in Lebanon, and this is important because here it's like a kind of like a double whammy. Like, Israel again violates the sovereignty and autonomy of a bordering nation state to assassinate a Palestinian writer, right? So it's like, yeah, that's.
They're denied the right to freedom of peaceful assembly. So when they do have demonstrations and protests, they're met with things like tear gas, or bullets, or whatever else. Can we go to the next slide, please? Does someone want to read this? Okay.
The police routinely use force and arrest against Arab demonstrators as a deterrent in order to silence voices of protest. Anti-war protesters against the Israeli military operation, quote, Kasled, unquote, in Gaza, mainly Arab citizens, including many minors, were subjected to serious police violence. They further encountered disproportionate and systemic mass arrests, primarily on the pretext of their mere presence at the scene. Until today, 10 years after the fact, no police officer, commander, or political leader has been held accountable for the killings of 13 unarmed Palestinian citizens of Israel in October 2000 during demonstrations staged against Israel's brutal policies in the occupied Palestinian territory.
Sound familiar? Anyone? It's really important, like, going through this to like link struggles and like consider like what this means like there and what it means here, because there's a lot of similarities, right? So freedom of association. So this bill aims to deny registration to associations that reject the existence of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. The law currently denies the registration of associations if they reject only the democratic component of the state. So essentially, as the Palestinian disenfranchised state, logically, Israel is not both Jewish and democratic, and call for a more equitable rule of the land. So Israel punishes them because the Israeli colonial project requires that it be Jewish and democratic. This obviously causes problems since historically, the majority of the people who live in this land are Christian and Muslim Palestinians. And even after all the uprooting, there are still millions of Christians and Muslims living there. Even worse, a Palestinian citizen of Israel is required, in order to be a good citizen, to accept that Israel is both Jewish and democratic. It is Jewish, that no Palestinian has control over. But is it democratic? When you hear Israeli politicians complain that Palestinians won't recognize Israel, this is what they're referring to.
So the creation of separate reserves and ghettos. So this is the chart that you saw earlier, where like this is all Palestine, and then it gets smaller as time goes on. And you see that how they separate it. They want the Palestinian territory to be completely separate, and then you have the little blobs. And there is so many people in the Gaza Strip that it's hard to like move. They don't have room, and they can't leave, and they can't. Nobody can come in, and so it's hard for them to function. And like Nadine said earlier, Gaza won't be livable in 2020.
So Arab towns and villages in Israel proper suffer from severe overcrowding, and Arabs and Palestinians with Israeli citizenship only populate 2.5% of the total area of the state. So since 1948, the state of Israel has established approximately 600 Jewish municipalities, whereas no new Arab village, town, or city has been built. Next. Next. So, de facto prohibition of marriages. Does anyone want to read this slide? Okay, so I'll explain. Okay, so basically, like a Palestinian with Israeli citizenship cannot marry a Palestinian with West Bank ID. Well, they can marry each other, but a Palestinian with Israeli citizenship cannot give Israeli citizenship to a Palestinian with West Bank ID. So that means they can be married but live in separate territories. So they're separated, right? And this is kind of a new addition to one of Israel's 50 laws discriminating against Palestinians with Israeli citizenship. Next.
So the
Expropriation.
of land and property. She's been working on it. Okay, so in a report written by United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs titled Demolitions and Forced Displacement in the Occupied West Bank, it was found that more than 60% of the Palestinian-owned structures demolished in 2011 were located in areas allocated to settlements. According to another OCHA report titled The Humanitarian Impact of Israeli Settlement Policies, the settlement population in the occupied territories is estimated to be at 520,000 and has been growing by 5.3% each year for the last decade. The report reveals that 43% of the West Bank, a Palestinian territory, is off limits to Palestinian use because of its allocation to settlements. So, even in Palestinian land, there are Jewish settlements, and so you're telling them that like this is their land, but then you're using it for other people. And this is also why this is an argument against the two-state solution, because you know the land that Palestinians have, Israel isn't going to withdraw from, and the land that Israel has put money into and has built settlements onto isn't going to give that land back to Palestinians because they just inserted all of that money into it. So, yeah, that's that.
So this is a really interesting one. So you see the CIA General Council like citing Israeli torture as an example for themselves, right? So the Israeli example, torture was necessary to prevent imminent significant physical harm to persons where there is no other available means to prevent harm. And then here is a quote from the Israeli Government Commission in 1987 following the deaths of 2 Palestinian prisoners. And this is how the Israeli government uses their vocabulary against Palestinians, right? So the exertion of a moderate degree of physical pressure, torture, cannot be avoided. So just like the use of vocabulary and like how oppressive like vocabulary is in this sentence, like they are like completely erasing and evading accountability for torture by using like nice language like this. Next. So a recap. We talked about how Palestinians are denied the right to work, the right to education, the right to leave and return to their country, right to a nationality, right to freedom of movement and residence, right to freedom of opinion and expression, right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association, arbitrary arrest, creation of separate reserves and ghettos, prohibition of marriages, expropriation of land belonging to a racial group, and subjecting a racial group to torture. Next. So what does this all add up to?
Apartheid.
That was not for you. Anyway.
I second that.
So, apartheid, as defined by the United Nations, is arbitrary arrest and illegal imprisonment of the members of a racial group. Next. Denying a racial group the right to work, the right to education, the right to leave and return to their country, the right to a nationality, the right to freedom of movement and residence, the right of freedom of opinion and expression, the right to freedom of peaceful assembly and association. Next. Creation of separate reserves and ghettos, prohibition of mixed marriages, expropriation of landed property. Next. And torture. Next. So that is the definition of apartheid as given to you by the United Nations. I didn't say it was apartheid. The United Nations said it was apartheid. Okay, so don't come at me like today I come bearing an olive branch in one hand and the freedom fighter's gun in the other. Do not let the olive branch fall from my hand. This is a quote from the former leader of the Palestine Liberation Organization, Yasser Arafat.
So some tools of resistance are art, dance, hunger strikes, linking struggles, memory, music, poetry, popular protests, preservation, reproduction, and writing.
So this is a picture of Hamdallah, and Najib Ali, he's a really famous Palestinian cartoonist. He drove Hamdallah. He drew Hamdallah, and he first appeared in 1969 in Kuwait. And the figure here turned his back to the world in 1973, and it's symbolic because Hamdallah will remain 10 years old his entire life. So Najib Ali said that Hamdallah depicts himself at the age that he was forced to flee from Palestine in 1948. And Hamdallah will only turn his face back to the world when Palestine is free and Palestinians are allowed to return to their country. So it's symbolic because he turned his back on the world the way the world turned their back on Palestinian children. And you see that he's wearing like raggedy clothes and no shoes, and this is symbolic of his allegiance to the poor. So this is like a really important image. And Najib Ali was actually assassinated in he was assassinated in London. So we probably will never see Hamdallah's face, but that was the goal, that when Palestine was free that he would issue another cartoon with his face. And then here you see another like a playoff of Hamdallah using a Mike Brown. So you see like the linking of struggles. Next.
Humor. So some Palestinian pickup lines. You guys actually want me to read them?
Yes, read them, please.
Your beauty is harder to define than Israeli borders. Let's do what the Palestinian Authority and Israel do behind closed doors. I find the apartheid wall for you. These are good. The Valentine's Day is coming up. I'd like the right to return to your bed.
She got weak. She put that in
So cool. This is my best friend.
Go on.
Yeah.
Go on to the next one.
Hunger strikes.
Cool.
So this is the tactic used by Palestinian prisoners to resist their imprisonment. Like we saw this a lot in the last couple of years. Next.
Linking struggles. So this is the Palestinian consulate in Mexico City, and that's the apartheid wall. And you want to read them.
So how does it feel to be or how does it feel to be a question? How does it feel to be a problem? Is what it translates to directly from Arabic, and it says Rip Trayvon. Next. So this is the first Palestinian rap group named DAM, and they are modeled after NWA. So you want to click? If you want to click. Is the sound working?
I should be fixing it.
Yeah, it's working.
So that song is called Born Here. If you like it, you can search it later. It's by DAM. Next.
Dad came to Loyola 3 years ago.
So poetry. The fish, even in the fisherman's net, still carries the smell of the sea. So throughout the Arab world, Palestinians are known for their poetry. We have some of the best poets. Throughout the Arab world, we have Mahmoud Darwish, Murid Barghouti, and most of the poems that Palestinians write are about indigeneity and the feelings of displacement and loss and exile. Next. Go ahead.
So another form of resistance is popular protests, and so on your left, that would be Nakba, the Nakba Day in 2011 in South Lebanon, where there are a lot of refugee camps that Palestinians reside in. And then this one is in March of 2011 in the West Bank.
So preservation is a big one. Because we were forcefully expelled from our homes, but memory is a big thing, right? Like our grandparents passing down the stories of their Nakba experiences and telling us the stories of like their displacement, and that's like one way that we can hold on to our culture. Another thing is like the key. So because Palestinians that were expelled in 1948, a lot of them saved the keys to their homes, hoping that they would go back one day and be able to use them to get in. And unfortunately, it hasn't been the case, but hopefully it will be in the future. But this is another thing, passing down the key to the home that you were expelled from. So you hear it's complicated a lot, and I think it's important to talk about who made it complicated and who is it complicated for. Next. So Palestinians are divided into three groups essentially, right? So Palestinians from 1948, that were expelled in 1948, or it happens that they were able to stay and get Israeli citizenship down the line, and that was the minority. And then Palestinians residing in the West Bank, and then Palestinians residing in Gaza. So there's Palestinians with Israeli citizenship, there's Palestinians in Jerusalem with a green ID, Palestinians in the West Bank, Palestinians in Gaza, Palestinians in refugee camps in Palestine, Palestinians in Lebanon, Palestinians in Syria, Palestinians in Jordan, Palestinians in the greater Arab world, and then Palestinians in the diaspora, aka like Europe, the US. So Palestinians are like systematically like divided with different ID systems, different citizenships, and are subjected to different laws depending on where they're residing. Next. So this quote, "Today there is a virtual caste system within the territories that Israel controls between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, with Israeli Jews at the top and Muslim and Christian Palestinians in the occupied territories at the bottom. In between are Palestinians with Israeli citizenship and Palestinian residents of occupied East Jerusalem." Next. So a lot of the time you hear, why Israel? Why Palestinians? And you hear, like, why are you singling out Israel? And it's important to know, like, we're not the ones singling out Israel. Israel is singling it out itself. The U.S. is singling out Israel when they give Israel $3 billion a year in military aid. The UN is singling out Israel when they don't hold them accountable to international law, right? So you see Israel evading accountability throughout its history. And so it's not us that are picking Israel. It's the world powers that are picking Israel and singling Israel out. So hold on, back a little bit. So I wrote this down. Israel is heralded in the U.S. media and by government officials as a leader of the free world, a civilized nation among savages, a poor suburban family in a bad neighborhood, and it's on us to hold it accountable. What's funny about why Israel is that it's not new. Whenever there have been calls for progress, there is always those who say, why now, why here, and well, why not? So, next.
So tools of global solidarity in 2005, a BDS call to action was issued by Palestinian intellectuals, and so it's like boycott, divestment, and sanctions call to action. And so we want to boycott Israeli goods. We want to divest from corporations that aid in the various human rights violations that are happening in Palestine. And we want different countries to sanction Israel. We want them to completely boycott from Israel. And BDS has 3 demands that are already mandated by international law. It's very important to note that they are already out there. They're mandated and they're just not being followed. The first one is to end occupation of Arab lands occupied after 1967 and the dismantlement of the wall. Number 2 is equal rights for Palestinian citizens of Israel. And number 3 is the right to return for Palestinian refugees. And so far, none of these have been met.
Next slide. So this is just some sources if you're interested in getting more information. But are there any questions? Is there anything new you learned from this presentation? And is there anything more you want to know?
Okay, so I have 2 questions. My first question is about the 6-Day War. Was someone helping Israel in their winning that war? I just don't fathom the fact that that's possible, that they won it against all of the Arab nations surrounding them.
So during the 6-Day War, because keeping in mind that like the neighboring Arab states surrounding the state of Israel, the leadership resulted from European colonialism, right? So these European colonial powers put puppets in the surrounding Arab states, and because of that, it's almost fact that the king of Jordan at the time gave Israel a heads up that the Arab states were planning an attack. So that's like a big reason why it's considered that's a big reason why Israel was able to mobilize his army that fast. And then another thing is that's really important. So Israel was being provided tanks and guided warplanes by the U.S. government. But then the U.S. government was also supplying some weapons to Egypt at the same time. So you saw the U.S. funding kind of both sides of it. And then also during this time, this is the beginning of the U.S. and Israel alliance, because around this time, the U.S. had just lost the war to Vietnam. So there's something called the Vietnam syndrome. And it's basically the U.S. felt its masculinity had almost been violated or belittled. And then as a result, they saw Israel growing and expanding, and they said, this is a potential partner for us in the Middle East. And this is who we want to align ourselves with. So, and do you have another question?
Yeah, so then my second question was, I hear some people or on media identifying themselves as Israeli Arab, but aren't they just Palestinian, or is that wrong? I just don't get how you can be.
So I can't judge Palestinian citizens of Israel for the way that they identify, but it's really important in saying Palestinian citizens of Israel, because saying Israeli Arab or Arab Israeli kind of implies that these Palestinians immigrated to Israel, when that's not the case. Israel encroached upon them and sucked them into the state, right? So it's kind of inappropriate to say Arab Israelis or Israeli Arabs, but at the same time you have to keep in mind that vocabulary, maybe the people identifying that way don't have access to the vocabulary that we have access to, and that's their experience, and I'm not going to judge them for the way they identify. But personally, looking from the outside, well, I am Palestinian, so I'm not really looking from the outside. But it's important to say Palestinian citizens of Israel. Yeah, and a lot of the time you hear the same thing with Native American, or African American. A lot of people kind of use that same mindset. Saying African American is I guess inappropriate, because Africans did not migrate here. It was not a natural phenomenon, right? They were forced here. So America sucked them in, not the other way around. I don't know. So yeah. Yes.
Okay. My question is that when you say the Gaza Strip won't be able to be livable in 2020, why do you say that? Is there not a way to prevent that from happening?
So the United Nations said that Gaza Strip won't be livable by 2020, and it's not as though all Palestinians in the Gaza Strip will drop dead, or that Gaza will disappear. It's still going to be there, and Palestinians are still going to be inside. But what that does mean is that because of water contamination and because of the small territory and the growing reproduction of Palestinians inside of the Gaza Strip, that it's going to become overcrowded and unbearable to live in. And it's going to become even more uncomfortable than it already is. And then also because of unemployment and the destruction of the last 2 assaults on the Strip, and then you also have like the siege, which bans materials from getting inside the Gaza Strip to rebuild. So I guess it could be livable if Israel complied with international law and allowed Palestinians living inside the Gaza Strip like a right to like autonomy.
So basically, you're saying it's not really like attainable to change that because the United States looks at Israel as their ally.
Yeah. Right.
Basically, just what I want to know is what is like the ideal outcome for the people living there right now, and like what's their what are they working toward?
So I think it's important to say that we can't really speak on behalf of the people living there because everyone wants something different. Some people are content with a one-state solution. Some people want a two-state solution. But since we're not living there and we don't know, we know the conditions, but we're not living them firsthand, it's unfair for us to say what we would, like to see happen there. Obviously, we would like to see the state of Palestine happen, and for refugees to be allowed to return, and for the settlements to be taken down in Palestinian territory right now.
So I guess the ideal outcome is for the 3 demands of the boycott, divestment, and sanctions call to be adhered to, because those are the demands issued by Palestinian civil society, Palestinians living in Palestine, living out of Palestine, and they issued the 3 demands, which is essentially for Israel to be held accountable to international law and adhere to UN resolutions, the right of return, an end to the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, and then dismantlement of the wall and settlements.
So why is it important for us as U.S. citizens or people living here to endorse or uphold BDS, or what do we even do about it?
Okay, complacency is a big thing, right? Because we hold U.S. Well, I'm making an assumption here, but because we live in America or we hold U.S. citizenship, we are living in a nation that is literally the lifeline of the occupation, right? The U.S. is the life support of the occupation. Without the U.S., the occupation would not be possible. The United States provides Israel with an amazing amount of support and $3 billion a year in military aid, which is $8 million a day, right? And then you see American corporations providing materials to the Israeli occupation, sustaining it. So the Israeli occupation is being sustained by this country. And because of that, it is our responsibility to act. And that's how I see it.
You mentioned BDS being used as a strategy or tactic to stand in solidarity. Are there any other strategies being used besides BDS?
You wanna answer?
I think just generally awareness and the one thing that most solidarity groups and people in solidarity outside of Palestine have been doing is BDS, is because that's what was asked of us. But I think just awareness building, and I know people do policy stuff too, but mainly especially in the US right now, BDS is the main source of solidarity.
Yeah, because there was a Palestine solidarity activism pre-2005 before the BDS call was a thing. So that was generally what it was, demonstrations, campus activism. This is not this. We plug BDS in this event, but this is a way to, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Be in solidarity with Palestinians. So, yeah. Any other questions, comments? Okay, well, thank you for coming. I hope this was useful and helpful. And if you did not sign up for SJP's listserv, go ahead. And she has an announcement.
Yeah. So in April, we will be hosting Israeli Apartheid Week. And so it'll be a week long of events that will happen